Hi and Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Siti Sarah binti Ismail. Our group will be presenting kepada factor proportion theory. Other participants for this presentation are Nona Fisah binti Muhammad Musa and Muhammad Amirul Akmal bin Mazhar. The presentation we are running is divided into 6 parts, namely the introduction, factor intensity in production, factor endowment, price and comparative advantage, the Lg2415ai paradox, Linde's overlapping, and conclusion.
My name is Nona Fisah. I will explain the introduction and factor intensity in production.
Changed drastically in the first half of the 20th century. The factor proposition theory, developed by the Swedish economist Eli Hackers, and later expanded by his former graduate student Bertil Ohlin, formed by the major theory of international trade and is still widely accepted today. Smith and Ricardo emphasize a labor theory of value. The factor proposition theory is based on a more modern concept of production that raise capital to the same level of importance as labor. Alright, the factor intensity in production theory is a two-dimensional concept and includes labor and capital. Technology determines the way labor and capital combine to form a product. Different products require different proposition of these two factors of production. Next is factor proposition of the production of the product differs substantially among group of products. It's easy to see how the factor proposition of the production differ substantially among group of products. For example, the manufacturing of leather footwear is still a relatively labor-intensive process, even with the most sophisticated leather treatment and patterning machinery. Other products such as computer memory chip still require some highly skilled labor, but really more on massive quantities of capital for production development and facilities. The concept of factor proposition is very useful in the comparison of the production process of goods. And then, number 3 is depend on the state of technology and the current method of manufacturing of given products. According to factor proposition theory, factor intensity depend on the state of technology and the current method of manufacturing of a given product. The theory assumes that the same technology of production would be used for the same goods in all countries. It is not therefore different in the efficiency of products of production that will determine trade between countries, as it did in classical theory. Classical theory implicitly assume that technology or the productivity of labor is different across country. Otherwise, there would be no logical explanation as to way one country would require more unit of labor to produce a unit of output than another country. Factor proposition theory assumes no such productivity difference.
Hi and Assalamualaikum. My name is Siti Sarah binti Ismail. Today I would like to explain a little bit about factor endowment, price and comparative advantage. I am pleased to provide a little explanation regarding the factor endowment. Factor endowment refer to the land, labor, capital, and enterprise within an economy. Next is factor price and comparative advantage. These prices are determined by the labor and capital endowments that the country possesses. The theory assumes that labor and capital are immobile, which implies that they are unable to move across national borders. Therefore, as compared to other countries, the endowments of a country determine the relative cost of labor and capital. Each nation is defined or measured by the quality of labor and capital its own. If a country has more labor and less capital compared to other nations, it would be characterized as being relatively labor abundant. It is cheaper to do what is more plentiful. A labor-abundant country would therefore have relatively inexpensive labor. There are two examples for factor endowment. Firstly is China. A nation such as China has a relatively large labor endowment and a smaller capital endowment. China has cheaper labor, so it should specialize in manufacturing and exporting labor-intensive products. Secondly is Japan. Japan is a relatively capital-abundant nation with a smaller labor force. Japan has relatively inexpensive capital and should specialize in manufacturing and exporting capital-intensive products. For your information, the comparative advantage is derived not from a country's productivity, but from the relative abundance of its production factor. Starting with this assumption, the factor proportion theory states that, number one, a country that is relatively labor abundant should specialize in the production of relatively labor-intensive goods. It should then export this labor-intensive good in exchange for capital-intensive good. Second is a country that is relatively capital abundant should specialize in the production of relative capital-intensive good. It should then export this capital-intensive good in exchange for labor-intensive good.
Next, we go to the Lg2415 paradox. So, what is the Lg2415 paradox? Lg2415 paradox is the one of the most famous tests of any economic or business theory occurred in 1960 when economist Wesley Lg2415 tested whether the factor proportion theory could be used to explain the types of goods the United States import and export. The observation by Wesley Lg2415 1906 until 1999 that in spite of being the world's most capital-rich country, the US appeared on average to have exports that were slightly more labor intensive than its imports. This was thought to be paradoxical because the Hasker-Olin model of international trade lead people to expect that US export will be capital intensive and its import will be labor intensive. These are two possible explanations for the paradox. First, that the simple Hasker-Olin model ignores the role of natural resources in affecting trade. And second, that because of its large investment in human capital, which gave it a highly skilled labor force, the effective US labor supply was much larger than the mere number of workers would suggest. So next we go to Linde overlapping. So Linde's overlapping is focused on the preference of consumers or demand rather than production or supply. Linde argued that trade in manufactured goods was dictated not by cost but by the demand for similar types of products across countries. This theory was based on two principles. The first one is as per capita income rise, the complexity and quality level of products demanded by a country's residents also rises. The range of product sophistication demanded by a country's residents is largely determined by its level of income. The second one is the business firms that produce a society's need are more knowledgeable about their domestic market than foreign market. The firms could not be expected to effectively service a foreign market that is significantly different from the domestic market because the ability to compete comes from experience in the home market. A logical pattern would be for the firm to gain success and market share at home first and then expand to foreign markets that have a demand for similar products.
As the conclusion, the theory factor proportion developed by the Swedish economist Eli Hescher and later extended by Berlin Ohlin, his former graduate student. The theory is based on country's production factor, which is land, labor, and capital, which provide the fund for investment in plant and equipment. The theory determined that the cost of any factor or resources was a function of supply and demand. The theory called as factor proportion theory because it states that country would produce and export goods that require factors that were in great supply and therefore cheaper production factor. That's all. Thank you.